this theme that I'm about to speak to really has now uh, reached a point in the history of our country which almost brings tears to my eyes. Because we need to understand how it is that we got here and why it is that we've got here. So that's the first thing that I will speak about. I'll speak first about the pandemic, how it was handled and its impact on the economy. Then I will move on to discuss specifically the whole subject of jobs, how jobs have panned out in the run up to 2020, and what might happen from this point onwards in the next 3 years and beyond. And finally, I will turn to what is to be done if this, what we keep hearing from our leaders, demographic dividend, is to not become a demographic nightmare. I want to begin by just defining the demographic dividend. Because you keep hearing this term, but most of you youngsters don't necessarily fully understand what exactly it means. A dividend, the demographic dividend is defined as that period in the life of a nation when the share of the working age population is rising and the share of the dependent population is falling. Dependent population defined as those below 15 and those over 60 or 65. Now, as you can imagine, that this period comes but once in the life of any nation. Every nation goes through a demographic dividend. The real challenge lies before the leadership of that country, whether they will ride the wave of the demographic dividend and then the country transforms itself, or they don't. Because once the dividend is gone, it will never come back. And when what the meaning of that is that the country will become an aging society. Europe has become an aging society. China has become an aging society. India entered into its demographic dividend in the early 1980s. 40 years of this period is already over. There are 20 more years left, or even less, before the dividend is over. We will become an aging society. In fact, you would have read in the newspapers a few weeks ago about the government of India's own estimate about what, by which time India is likely to become an aging society. You might not have fully understood or grasped this. Today, the share of aged population is only 8%, and the average age of the population is only 26, so median ages. However, by 2036, the share of the aged in the total population would have jumped to 15%, by which time we would already be an aging society. China, rode the wave of its demographic dividend, grew at for 30 years at something like 9 to 10% per annum, and reduced poverty on a massive scale. India and China began per capita income in 1979. Look where China is. It is 4 to 5 times a larger economy than ours. Our 40 years of dividend is already over. We have only 20 more years left. Therefore, we have to grow fast. We have no choice at this point but to grow at anything less than 8 to 9% per annum over the next 20 years. If we do not, we will become an aging society without having become a rich country. You know what the Chinese are saying? Chinese leaders have been saying since 2015. Europe became old after they became rich. We have become old before we became rich. And they are saying it. Their per capita income is 4 times larger than ours. So can you imagine what is going to be our condition? We have more poor people in the country at this point of time than all of Africa taken together. Our rate of child malnutrition is worse than in Africa. So let me very quickly, this was by way of introduction. Let me very quickly turn to the pandemic. And I will use a reverse chronology to enable you to understand how our pandemic was handled by our government. On the 25th of March, a lockdown was imposed in our country when there were 692 cases. 692 cases only. It was also the strictest lockdown for any country in the world. In other words, one of the most populous countries of the world, one of the largest countries of the world, had an early a lockdown was announced at 4 hours notice, and the strictest lockdown in the whole world. Every city, every city was brought to a standstill. All trains was brought to a standstill. Everyone was asked to stay indoors. Now I want you to know that the WHO
bathroom saaf ho gaya the Tanusha.
Recommend. Can I request
whoever? Sorry, sir. Yeah, I would request Dr. Poonam Gupta ji to kindly mute yourself.
Actually, yeah. everyone could
should
kindly be muted. I'll really appreciate that. I'm sorry.
Really sorry for that. Yeah, she has muted herself. You can please.
Okay. WHO does not even recommend a lockdown. Anyway, you know what the China lockdown was like? You need to know, because China brought the pandemic under control very quickly. China initially only locked down Wuhan city, which is where the virus began. Wuhan city is the capital of Hubei province. They then locked down Hubei province, and that was that. They didn't lock down the entire country. In addition, what they did was to stop all rail and air travel between Hubei province and Wuhan and other parts of the country. That's all. By contrast, what did we do? We stopped all trains, all road traffic. We stopped all flights. We locked everyone into their own homes. A strict lockdown, the strictest in the whole country. Not one province, not one city, the whole country of 1.34 billion people. No country in the world did that at 4 hours notice. It was like demonetization. We are paying the price of this, and we will continue to pay the price of this. Because what happened as a result? Please remember, till about 2 months ago, you could read in the newspapers that 80% of all cases were confined to 9 cities. 80% of the country's COVID-19 cases were confined to 9 cities. That means it was not a national pandemic. It was when we began, first we locked people in those very cities, in the slums. In the slums, there is no social distancing. There is no physical distance possible when you are living 4 or 5 to a room. That's how migrant workers live. There is no sanitizer. There is no running water for you to wash your hands every 20 minutes or for 20 seconds. So you locked people in the very cities where the disease was spreading, brought in by international travelers like you and me, and they contracted the disease. Then you began opening up the country from the beginning of June, after a 2-month strictest lockdown in the world. And people started flowing out after contracting the disease. And what happened is precisely what should have been expected, because they have taken the disease to the rest of the country. Now, for the last month, you can see that the share of the major cities in the pandemic cases has dropped to 50%, and the rest of the country now accounts for it. The cases are shooting up in UP, Bihar, Rajasthan, Chhattisgarh, Madhya Pradesh, etc. Precisely the states which have among the weakest health sectors in the country. Clearly, so enough about the pandemic. I'm moving very quickly to tell you what the impact on the economy was. But before I turn to the economic impact of the strictest possible lockdown, so I have to remind you that the economy was slowing down for 9 quarters prior to March of 2020. And that was slowing down because the 4 engines of growth, the 4 engines which drive the GDP of a country and incomes, had all slowed down very sharply. Consumption was slowing down. Consumption accounts for 58 to 60% of total GDP. I'll come back to that in a minute, why that consumption was slowing down, because it has directly to do with jobs. Private investment had been slowing down. Private investment, which had shot up from 2003-04 level of 23% of GDP to 38% of GDP by 2008. And even though it had begun to fall after the global economic crisis, it was still at 31% of GDP in 2013-14. That had fallen sharply to 28% by last year. Private investment was sputtering because of the banking crisis, which you've already heard Viral Acharya speak about. I will myself come back to that subject shortly. The third engine of growth, exports. Merchandise exports were at the level of $315 billion in the financial year 2013-14, the last year before this government came to power. For 25 years until 14, merchandise exports had been rising, systematically rising at the rate of at least 10% per annum. Exports to GDP ratio had risen from 11% of GDP in 1991 to 25% of GDP in the peak year 2008. But post 2014, every year, merchandise exports fell in absolute terms. The global economy was doing okay. So don't blame the global economy. In absolute terms, dollar values of exports fell every year. They recovered to just over $315 billion in 1819. They have gone back down in 1920. Third engine of growth is sputtering also. And then finally, the fourth engine of growth, which is government expenditure. Government expenditure had been dropping as a proportion of GDP. The fiscal deficit, the real fiscal deficit, despite the consolidation efforts of the government, were, as the Comptroller and Auditor General of India told us in the year 1819, was already at 5.68% of GDP, not the 3.8% of GDP that the government was telling you it was. The real number was 5.68. This is for the central government alone. Then you add on the 3% of state governments, then the fiscal deficit rises to 8.5 to 9% of GDP, which is already a silent fiscal crisis. But in all of this, we decided to inflict wounds upon ourselves. The government did. First came the demonetization. Totally uncalled for at 4 hours' notice. It didn't achieve any of the goals that it was announced to have, supposed to have. It slowed the economy down. Before the economy, particularly the unorganized sector, and yet the government had the audacity to tell us that in the financial year that the demonetization took place, the GDP grew at 8.2%. Can anyone believe that? No one can believe that. That is why the numbers themselves on GDP are not acceptable. Certainly not for that year. Because let me explain how. Let me explain how the estimation for the unorganized sector for GDP is done. I teach a whole course on the informal sector to my MA students in JNU, by the way. Because the unorganized sector is unregistered, the government has no way of collecting estimates of what is the value added in the unorganized sector. And the unorganized sector, please note, contributes 45% of GDP. It accounts for about 80% of employment, but it accounts for 45% of GDP. So the way that estimation is done is that the NSO, the CSO, look at what in a particular sector, the organized sector GVA is, the gross value added is, and they project that onto the unorganized part of that same sector. And this is how they build it up, aggregate it up for the unorganized sector. Now, the demonetization had a massive downward impact on the unorganized sector, which it didn't on the organized sector. You and I practically, came away unscathed, but the unorganized sector was devastated. Unemployment grew very sharply in the unorganized sector, a subject which I will turn to very shortly. Before that shock to the economy had just begun to recover, you got an ill-planned, poorly designed, and badly implemented GST. It had been discussed for 10 years, but why it had to be implemented overnight in a tryst with destiny type of moment in Parliament, in an extremely poorly designed, it really set the economy back again. And you are already seeing the impact of that. GST revenues have been falling. The government doesn't have enough revenues to actually pay the legitimate and rightful share of the states, which they are entitled to constitutionally, as though that was not enough. In the beginning of 2019, just before the elections were due to be held, the government decided to cut off one of its own arms by raising the personal income tax threshold from 2.5 lakhs per annum, at which your income begins to incur a personal income tax, raised it from 2.5 lakhs per annum to 5 lakhs per annum. Just before the election, in order to win over the middle class. When the threshold was 2.5 lakhs per annum for personal income tax, the number of taxpayers, personal income taxpayers, was 60 million. Very small for a large economy like ours, but still 60 million. When you raised it to 5 lakhs, the number of personal income taxpayers fell from 60 million to 15 million, a drop of 45 million. So the government's direct tax revenues fell on account of that. Self-inflicted wound number 3 after demonetization and a poorly planned GST. Self-inflicted wound number 4 came in the middle of 2019 in July, when the government reduced its corporate tax rates from 30% to 25%. Overnight, it eliminated it eliminated exemptions. But this is an action which didn't bring about and couldn't have brought about the kind of impact that the government was hoping for. Why it was hoping for that impact, God alone knows, because the government was thinking, oh, this is going to raise private investment. Well, it didn't. All that it did was it raised the corporate savings. And the government lost at least 1 lakh crores per annum on account of this reduction of corporate income tax at a time when the economy was slowing and all other revenues were slowing. Please remember that the corporate income tax rate was supposed to be lowered 5 years earlier from 30% to 25% over with 1 percentage point decline every year. The government didn't do it for 5 years. It does it now and shot itself in the foot even further. So you had what used to be a silent fiscal crisis I spoke about becoming into a catastrophic fiscal crisis. So all 4 engines of growth stopped functioning. Now, when the pandemic breaks, we wait 2 months to put in a stimulus. And still on the first point, I'm turning to employment very quickly, because all of this slowing of the economy had implications for jobs, which I will speak about very shortly. What was the nature of the stimulus that was put in place? The rich countries put in place stimulus of 10% of GDP. So did we, or so-called. 9 of the 10% of stimulus was in the form of bank loans, bank guarantees. Now, that means the banks were expected to be giving loans when they were already unwilling to give loans for several years because of the NPA crisis. Now, companies, small and big, will borrow if there is demand. But what had happened on account of the catastrophic lockdown and the collapsing economy after the lockdown, and which had come on top of a slowing economy, was that demand was collapsing. I began by talking about that consumption demand was slowing for the last several years. It completely collapsed. But how can you improve or increase demand? By putting money into people's pocket, for which you need a fiscal stimulus. What is a fiscal stimulus? It could have 2 components. You can increase expenditure or you can cut taxes. Well, you couldn't cut taxes any longer because your GST was giving you nothing not giving you enough in any case. And PIT and corporate taxes you had already cut, so there was no scope for cutting taxes. And you couldn't increase expenditure because your fiscal deficit had already been quite high and the economy was slowing. Therefore, it was likely that the revenues will fall even further. So the government just couldn't bear the thought of increasing expenditure. So fiscal stimulus size was 1% of GDP. 9 plus 1 is 10. Contrast this to the global economic crisis. When it hit us, I was part of the planning commission. I was part of the team which was putting together the fiscal or the full stimulus. We put in a stimulus of 3.5% of GDP at a time when the crisis was much smaller compared to this. This is unprecedented in the history of the world, and this is unprecedented in the history of our country. And yet, our fiscal stimulus was 1% of GDP. Let me stop there. So why would you expect the economy to revive very quickly? Given the state of the economy, let me quickly turn to the subject of jobs, the second part of my lecture. You need to understand the rate at which the economy was growing prior to 2014 in order to understand what happened thereafter and what juncture we were at in terms of economic growth and job creation in 2020. The reason why the dividend is called a dividend is because it enables people to get jobs in the non-agricultural sector, in industry and services, where the productivity is higher than in agriculture. Therefore, incomes rise. As incomes rise in these non-agri jobs, your savings rise. As savings rise, your investment rises. That sets in motion a whole virtuous cycle of further growth. That's why the dividend is called a dividend, because the large and growing working age population enables that to happen as they get jobs. If they don't get jobs, this demographic dividend is going to stop. In other words, it will become a nightmare. We were growing at 8% per annum between 2004 and 14, despite a global economic crisis, please note. And we were adding 7.5 million new non-agri jobs, 7.5 million new non-agricultural jobs every year. at a time when only 2 million people were joining the labor force, which pulled millions of workers out of agriculture for the first time in India's history, because for 50 years until 2004, the absolute number of workers in agriculture had been increasing. The share of workers in agriculture had been falling until 2004, but the absolute number of workers was increasing because of population increase. But it was for the first time post 2004, because we were growing at an unprecedented pace. This is precisely the pattern that China experienced. Non-agri job growth, because non-agri output growth happened. So we were creating 7.5 million new non-agricultural jobs, which pulled out 5 million people from agriculture every year. These were the people who started coming to the cities. These are the migrants that we are talking about. I'll come back to that in a minute. Because of the missteps and the mismanagement of the economy post-2014, the growth rate began to slow, which I've already been talking about. The job growth fell to 2.9 million per annum from 7.5 million per annum. The result was that millions of young people who had entered school in growing numbers, because there had been a sharp expansion in enrollment in school education, in secondary and higher secondary, and as a result of that, tertiary education enrollment had shot up from 11% in 2006 to 26% in 2016. On a growing base of young people, 11 to 26%. So there had been a massification of the tertiary education system, of which all of you students are evidence. The interesting thing is that these youngsters who had entered university were also going to leave university and start looking for jobs. When they started looking for jobs, they already were discovering that jobs were not growing at anywhere close to the rate at which they were growing until 2014. They were now growing at only 2.9 million per annum as opposed to 7.5 million. That means a down to 40% of the previous level. And because jobs were growing fast earlier, wages had been rising, salaries had been rising, and because of that, poverty had declined sharply in our country. The number of the poor had, for the first time in the history of our country, fell between 2004 and 2012 by a whopping 140 million for the first time in India's history. That's a staggering achievement. In other words, in 7 years, 20 million people were rising above the poverty line every year because non-agri jobs were growing. Real wages were growing as a result of that, because labor market in rural areas were tightening, and as a result, wages began to rise in rural and therefore in urban areas. And therefore poverty fell. Absolute number of poor fell. This is an achievement of Chinese proportions, of staggering Chinese proportions. What has happened since then? I just told you, only 2.9 million jobs. When so few jobs happen, when young people are entering the labor force in increasing numbers, open unemployment begins to increase. Open unemployment trebled between 2012 to 2018 and 19. It went from 2.2% to 6%. But you will be more interested in what happened to youth unemployment, and I want to tell you some numbers there. And this was the situation prior to the pandemic, and therefore beware of the labor market you are about to enter. If you had only secondary education, the open unemployment rate in 2012 was 6%. It had gone to 14.5% in 2018. If you were someone with a higher secondary, it went from 10.8% to 24%. If you were a graduate, which is what you are likely to be soon, it went from 19% to 36%. I'm talking about 2018-19. If you were postgraduate and above, it went from 21% to 36%. If you were someone with a technical degree, it went from 18.8% to 37%. So in other words, youth unemployment trebled also. This was the state of the economy and the state of employment at that point, before the pandemic. there were three groups who are particularly in need for jobs. One, those who are entering the labor force in increasing numbers and have already become unemployed. Then there are those who are entering the labor force every year. And now there are at least 5 million youngsters who are entering the labor force every year. And this number is going to increase at an accelerating pace between 2020 and 2030, after which it will increase at a decelerating pace from 2030 to 2040, but it will still be increasing. So we have to create millions of new jobs, at least 10 to 12 million per annum, to absorb those who were unemployed in 2019, who are now becoming unemployed, because we know that 21 million, the CMIE has told us, of salaried jobs, regular salaried jobs, have been lost in the last 3 months. So that means if there were 30 million people unemployed in 2019, you now have about 51 million people unemployed today. So can you imagine what this means for our demographic dividend, for which we have only 20 more years left? Given that we have seen a contraction of the economy by 24% this quarter, and this will continue, and this fiscal year will end with no less than 10% decline compared to 1920 decline. Even the RBI had suggested quite early on that it's only towards the end of the second half of the next year, fiscal year 22, that we will begin to see reasonable recovery. And it's clear from this that in the next 2 to 3 years, we will not see GDP levels, income levels returning to 1920 levels, despite this recovery, until 22-23, 3 years from now. So in other words, 2.5 to 3 years, you can wipe them out from the history of our country, from the lives of our young people. Because hundreds of thousands are losing jobs every year from regular jobs. What about beyond 3 years? What does the scenario look like? The scenario looks very bleak, because already private investment is unlikely to revive, given that there is no demand. And the banks were already facing an NPA crisis of 9% of their total advances, because over the 5 or 6 years, the government had not done enough to actually resolve the NPA crisis. If anything, something additional came on. What is that? What is called the double balance sheet or dual balance sheet problem of the corporate's profitability on the one hand, and the bank's crisis on the other. On that, you added on 2 more crises. What? The banks, which had received a lot of liquidity after the demonetization, and people, because the corporates were not borrowing, started to lend in order to keep their profits afloat. They started to lend to NBFCs, the non-banking financial companies, the ILFSs, and Diwan Housing, and so on. Who were the NBFCs lending to? Because, see, total credit in the economy is about 123 lakh crores, of which 100 lakh crores is the banks, and about 23 lakh crores is the NBFCs. So who were the NBFCs lending to? Construction companies. Construction companies, which had not been doing well because demand was not rising, and as construction companies were not doing well, they started defaulting on their NBFC loans. So we now had, on top of the dual balance sheet problem, a quadruple balance sheet problem of NBFCs and construction companies on top of that. So construction is absolutely critical for our job sector, because in the non-agri sector, for those who are unskilled, who want to leave agriculture, that's where they get absorbed, in construction. But construction is collapsing all around us. So the impact of all this spiraling downwards is the following: that even after 3 years, when we might expect to level out at 1920 GDP levels, we should expect no more than 3 to 5% GDP growth for several years to come from FY23 onwards. Forget about the 8% per annum that we achieved between 2004 and 14. Forget about the 9 to 10% per annum of GDP growth that for 30 years China achieved to reduce poverty to its historically low levels. We will be adding more young people to the labor force every year at an accelerating pace, as I was saying to you. That's a demographic trend. And yet we will be growing at 3 to 5% per annum for several years to come thereafter. That is the labor market that you are likely to face, not just when you graduate, but for years to come. Let me turn very quickly to what is to be done if we want to revive the economy and we want to prevent this eventuality. We can only dampen this eventuality. We have already been taken down the primrose path of disaster. We can only dampen it, and we have to act now. It's already very late. There has to be a much bigger fiscal stimulus, because without the fiscal stimulus, which I talked about earlier, there is not a hope in hell that demand will increase, and in the absence of demand, the MSMEs, which generate most of the jobs, will begin to revive. How should we be raising demand? We need to do at least 4 or 5 things, and I will quickly go through them and I will finish. Manrega, the government is already attempting to do. It increased the allocation from 60,000 crores for this budget to 1 lakh crores. In other words, it increased it by 40,000 crores. But within 3 months, 58,000 crores of that budget for this financial year has already been run through, because the demand by reverse migrants who've gone back has shot up dramatically, and Manrega work is not being, the government is not being able to be provided to all those who are looking for work. So in the months of May and June, the Manrega website tells us that 80 million persons looked for work, only 62 million found work, 18 million did not. Manrega. So the government will have to increase its spending on Manrega. There is no question about it. Second, the government needs to introduce an urban Manrega. If it was to introduce an urban Manrega, it would be substitutive of expenditure on rural Manrega, because it will generate work in urban areas, because it will bring some of the workers back from the rural areas where there was already an excess of workers, and there's been now an even further excess. So wages are going to drop there, and wages are already dropping there. And as wages drop, contrary to what happened until 2014, obviously poverty is going to increase. That's an inevitable outcome, inevitable eventuality, that poverty is going to increase sharply in the country, which already accounted for the largest number of poor in the world, larger than all of Africa taken together. It's critical that, because if you have urban Manrega, you'll have to spend less on rural Manrega. You can create housing, low-cost housing for migrants, among various other things. Point 2. Point 3. The government should put in place something much more than it has done. The 500 rupees for 3 months in Jan Dhan accounts didn't do the job. It couldn't have done the job. What's 500 rupees when you've lost all your savings and your livelihood? And millions did, because overnight in April, the 122 million were unemployed. I was saying that earlier there were 30 million that had shot up by 90 million to 122 million. Okay, that is, the open unemployment rate has fallen. I can come back to that in a minute. But the point is, what is that dropping, that reduction in the open unemployment rate means? It means very little, because all that means was that Manrega work increased, so some people were employed there. The sowing and the cutting season was on in rural areas, therefore that work increased, but that season is now over. So rural unemployment is going to increase very sharply again. Moreover, in the cities, if open unemployment fell, what did that mean? All the informal workers, the redi wala, the mochi, the sabzi, the istri karne wala, the choti dukan, the nai, they all opened. So so-called open unemployment fell. But simultaneously, we started getting the news that 21 million people in 2 months have lost jobs, 3 months have lost jobs, which are salaried and regular workers. As it is, they account for only 22% of the total workforce of 466 million. Therefore, this situation is really seriously grim. You need to put in place a minimum income guarantee which goes beyond PM Kisan. I've already shared the design of this with the Niti Aayog. It's possible for our country to afford a minimum income guarantee of about 2,500 rupees for about 3 months for 60% of rural households and 40% of urban households. Sorry, 70% of rural and 40% of urban households. That gives us about 60%, which are very marginal families and very, very vulnerable families. Only for 3 months you need to give that. After that, you can sharply cut that down to 500 rupees a month, which is the equivalent of the PM Kisan. The problem with the PM Kisan is that it is meant only for owner cultivators in rural areas. It does not include tenant farmers. It doesn't include landless labor. It doesn't include non-farm rural poor people. In other words, the most marginal, most vulnerable in the rural who have lost incomes and wages have fallen. It doesn't cover them. Secondly, it doesn't cover anyone in urban areas. We're in desperate need of a minimum income guarantee. My last 2 points and I will finish. You may or may not be aware that our country, although being a low middle income country and being one of the top 5 countries in terms of market, in terms of full, GDP levels, is still one of the poorest in the G20. But forget G20 levels of public expenditure on health. We sometimes don't even match what low income countries spend on public expenditure on health. 1.15% of GDP was supposed to be increased to 2.5% of GDP according to the National Health Policy of 2017 by 2025. That target has to be brought forward to be taken to 2.5% of GDP by 2022, because this is a health crisis. The only element of the package that has been announced, which is related to health, is for PPEs, ventilators, a few hospital beds. It's not for buttressing the public health system. Kerala has a public health system which is functional, which is why it was able to control the disease, and even that is not, it's not working very well now, because as the second wave is beginning in Kerala. And we have not announced a single thing in our stimulus for the health sector. And finally, the country needs a manufacturing strategy. The country has not had a manufacturing strategy for the last 30 years. Since 1991, the economic reforms began, because we need to create new jobs in manufacturing, because manufacturing jobs actually fell between 2012 and 2019. They fell for the first time in the history of the country, which is a catastrophe. And I've already laid out a plan of action of what an industrial policy might consist of. If we don't put that, and banning TikTok is not an industrial policy. We used to be able to manufacture drugs, bulk drugs, from which we could manufacture formulations which you and I consume. But today, 80% of the active pharmaceutical ingredients for our drugs that you and I consume come from China, including for ibuprofen and for paracetamol. Did you know that? That's the state of our manufacturing. The share of manufacturing in GDP was 17% in 1991. Despite Make in India, it is still 17%. Because if Make in India was such a grand success story, then at least the share of manufacturing would have been higher than 17%. It is not. It is still the same. And the share of manufacturing in employment has actually fallen since 2012. The absolute number of workers in manufacturing has fallen. So in other words, we've got to have an industrial policy, a manufacturing strategy to create jobs in industry and not just in services. Services will continue, modern services will continue to create the jobs. That's where most of you and most even of our engineers, our IIT walas and IIM walas, that's where they end up, the services sector, not in manufacturing, because there aren't enough jobs in manufacturing. Anyway, if we don't generate the jobs at the rate at which millions are going to join the labor force, we will lose the demographic dividend. And the dividend over the next 15 to 20 years alone will become a nightmare. And you know what the outcome and the result of that will be? Because in 2045, between 2036 and 2040, we will already be an aging society. And what is the meaning of being an aging society? An aging society is one where there are millions more old elderly people who are living longer, and they need health expenditure. They need health services. But we don't spend enough on health services. Today, we will have to spend much, much more then when we will be an aging society. Second, it also means that people will want to stop working. When you are aged, you want to retire. You want to stop working. But 91% of our workforce is informal. It doesn't have any social insurance. It doesn't have any old age pension, death and disability insurance, let alone maternity benefit. That is a crisis we can avoid if we can begin by doing many of the things I've just been speaking about. Thank you very much. I'm finished.